No, I should be. Yeah. So, if we are, yeah. So since we're live, I first saw you on Nathan's channel, and you came in at the end of a stream, and then I kind of disagreed with you there, and I was trying to you because what was very interesting was you had said that Brittonic that evolution doesn't allow for morality. And I think Nathan was pushing back on that. And then I saw you on
Right.
President Sunday's show, and I found out actually I was agreeing with most of the things that you were saying. And the first thing I think that I agreed with what you were saying, and I felt like maybe, I mean, so to give some background, I used to be a conservative Republican. And so I used to argue against the welfare state and look down on poor people. So I'm very keen to when someone is making that argument. And when I realized you were not making an argument from, let's say, a conservative or even a racial position, you were just arguing from an evolutionary kind of standpoint. I thought you were very interesting because you were making a lot of sense in that way. So the other thing I thought you made sense what was, and it may not have been readily like the impact of what you were saying was that whenever you create free resources for a population, the population in the wild grows to fill that capacity. And for example, I have a bird feeder in my backyard, so I see that on a daily like visible kind of basis. And I also know if I start feeding the cats that live in the cemetery, a block away, then
Yeah, it's a
they would
principle
start.
that we understand for zoos, animals in general. We just don't like to think that the same logic applies to human.
Yeah, and so but President Sunday is a I consider him a friend of mine. We usually agree on most things, but like when he was trying to say, well, I have family members whose spouse is kind of politics, and I'm against it for those reasons. But I felt like that's not paying attention to the person in front of you because you weren't actually advocating a political kind of solution or anything. You were just so I thought like you said in nature we observe this, and I know for example for feral cats too, right? If you kept giving out food, you'd have 50 cats on your doorstep every day or in your backyard every day because the animals have kind of realized that this is a free food source. Especially by the way, when many times like I have a female cat, so if I let her out, she might just escape, but she'll come back, when she's pregnant and she needs like the calories to feed like 4 kittens in her stomach. So in her womb. So like they understand where the resources are, right? So she knows she'll get unlimited food. It's very nutritious, to be in a house
Right.
now. So, and the next thing you have that many kittens. So and I think President Sunday he pushed back. He said, well, I don't want to apply evolutionary theory to people. And so
Which
that's
is something I understand because, well, Nathan had a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to that, which I definitely understand because there are like downstream implications to applying evolutionary theory to humans that are very uncomfortable to think about. But where he goes wrong is that Nazism is not one of them, or thinking that women are inferior, or drinking Mountain Dew, right? Those things are not part of it. But it's true that there are things that are implied by applying evolutionary thinking to human that are, let's just say, distasteful, right? Um, well, an example of that is what I discussed a little bit more with President Sunday, right? The fact that humans always, in a given environment, humans will always progressively optimize their behavior and their characteristics so that they get like good at reproducing in that environment. And so they progressively acquire the characteristics that make them able to reproduce in excess of available resources. And so this is a big problem, especially since, well, in the past it was a problem, but I suppose we just fought it out, right? We just fought sometimes, and that would diminish the size of the population, and then, would repeat that ad nauseum. But I think now that we have like nuclear armament, right? There's an argument to be made that we can't really have that kind of behavior anymore. Like, we can't just let the population fill the like grow until it reaches the limit of the available resources that we have, until we have to fight over what's left, because everyone's going to lose at that point. Like before, it might have been I don't know, a reasonable thing to divide and fight over resources because you had a fair chance of winning, right? But now it's almost a guarantee that everyone will, well, get the short end of the stick. There is no longer a longer end of the stick, I guess you could say.
Right.
So this is one example of a very uncomfortable implication of it, because if you wish to avoid that, well, the only thing that I can think of, the only alternative to letting, in a sense, nature limit our population through violence, well, through famine or war, is to limit it ourselves, right? Through like family planning and or population control. So this is an example of something that's not very pleasant to hear or consider, but I do think is necessary. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm in a Star Trek watch along on weekends with some friends from online, since COVID started. And we were just having a frank discussion about, but it's like already naturally, right? But like over the past 5,000 years, we've seen, for example, wheat. It's become like a much fatter plant. Probably it was like a thin grass when we found it in Mesopotamia, and we just keep selecting like the thickest strands of wheat. And so now we have like bountiful wheat and like fat cows, but cows must have been pretty thin, maybe back then. So and ourselves too, we have naturally selected ourselves to have fewer, cancers in middle-aged people when you can catch it, by the time you get married. But that's why it's more prevalent in old people, because like as a species, we've been weeded out a little bit, right? So over time, but the cats and dogs have it a lot more, right? Because they're still kind of like a wild thing, like especially feral cats. And so
well, they adapt to different things, right? They adapt to a wild environment, and so they are going to be wild, but we adapt to a civilized environment. So that the kind of adaptation that we develop are
right,
long-term thinking and
right.
self-control,
Civilization, right? Yeah.
right? But these things, at the end of the day, serve the purpose of allowing you to gather resources from society, right?
Right.
And so
Sorry,
they,
I'll finish that. But just the point though is
yep,
that
go ahead.
one funny thing that I said that we all kind of two people agreed on, including myself, was that eugenics would even be like a good idea, right? Because if you can just figure out, well, if two people they shouldn't have children together because it would be increase your likelihood of this disease genetically or
Yeah, I
whatnot.
think it gets a bad
Then
rap.
yeah, then it's actually a very logical idea. But then finally, when we look at the history of that idea, what it turns into. But otherwise, it'd be kind of smart to weed out for certain conditions or whatnot.
Right.
But
Well,
yeah, so
that's
I
the
see what
thing,
you're
right?
saying. It's funny how history unfolds. Also,
Well, I definitely agree about. I know that some of these measures have been tried in a rather crude way, and I think we should learn from those, especially from the failures and why they
right,
happened. And well, as far as eugenics are concerned, I think the way people used to think about it and do think about it and try to implement it is erroneous, right?
but
Because
it was
they
it
try
was common
to,
in most countries in a way. Like I mean, to be frank, right? Just because this is kind of an adult, like discussion. But I remember there's Supreme Court decisions, and we shouldn't. I don't mean to laugh at it, but there was a woman. It went to the court. And I forget it's early 1900s or late 1800s, but a woman was in a mental asylum,
right?
but her mother was in a mental asylum, and her mother was in a mental asylum. So like they were all found to be, and I think they also put generally like low IQ people or mentally handicapped people in that same kind of institution, because whether you were crazy or whether you were slow, it was kind of the same thing. Like you were kind of just put in a,
Right.
in that same kind of thing. So as cruel as it is, like we might imagine it today, but they were sterilizing people back then, and it went to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled that 3 generations of um, imbeciles is enough. You know, so it was like, the idea was, and like we think it's crazy today, right? But it's like, well, yeah, it's like for 3 generations, somebody has been living off the public purse or service.
Right.
Right. And it was now it's funny because President Sunday said, well, you can't sterilize people. And I later spoke to you a little bit privately, and I said, well, I had somebody who said, someone could take away your right to vote, if you receive social services. And well, I'll let you add anything, but I'll bring it back to, yeah, go ahead.
Right. Well, I think um, what do I think? This is a logical thing to consider from the point of view of a state, which is supposed to think about collective interest, right? So, of course, if you're going to sterilize someone, it is not a very good thing from the point of view of that person, but from the point of view of an entity that think about, the quote unquote collective good or collective interest. Yes, I could see how you can make that argument that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And well, that's the thing, right? It's not
Yeah.
merely 3 generations of imbeciles. It's because the imbeciles are life forms, so they multiply almost by
Mhm.
definition.
Mhm.
So you don't have just
Yeah.
3 generations. You have something like 1, then 2, then 4. If
Yeah.
you maintain the existence of a niche that allows them to thrive, they will thrive. It's not very nice thing to consider that you should interrupt that, but
Yeah.
I don't
So
know. They didn't kill her, right? They just they just at the
right,
end of
it's
the
just
day just
sterilization, right?
took away
Like your ability
some,
to
right.
put more on the
But-
public purse, right?
right.
And but here's the thing, like, I mean, the reason I reached out to you, and the reason like I admire you in a way, is because normally, like, I feel like President Sunday's discussion with you was in a way of responding to somebody who was simply espousing Tory politics, but you were simply arguing actually evolution doesn't give us morality in that sense. And then I thought, one thing that you said was 100% true, is that like you don't want to create someone to be in a situation where there's free resources, because you create freeloading behavior. And so, and of course, President Sunday correctly pointed out, you don't want to stigmatize the poor. You don't want to say that like, oh, you're freeloaders. That's just something that they've used to like, and then he also correctly pointed out many people are on benefits because they work. I mean, majority of people actually in my city, 80% of people on SNAP benefits, are food stamps, are working. So so it's just that the minimum wage isn't enough to raise your family size. And so I felt like he was giving you a good pushback, but actually that wasn't the argument you were making. And it's like a reason I wanted to have you on. It's because, like, like I said, I made the Tory, the kind of austerity argument. And and so because what you had said precisely, and I like to listen carefully, because like I said, I'm very keen when someone's making a judgment on the poor, like and it's something assuming that they're lazy. But you said that um, you want to create a um, feedback mechanism for self-sustaining yourself, and 100%, right? Like you don't want to, that's in the interest of someone who is seeking to apply for benefits. And you've seen
To
the
be fair
pattern.
to President Sunday, I wasn't very proud of that discussion. I gave him a lot of
No, I feel like
reasons
you
to
said that
think
three
I was
times
not
though.
very, yeah.
You said it 3 times, and
Well,
so I felt like, and I heard it the first time, and that in itself, like you're like, you weren't stigmatizing the entire. You weren't assuming that they're lazy. Like, for example, you shared something kind of personal about someone you know that's related to you that uses benefits for their whole life. And I felt like, me, I'm a very empathetic person, so I feel like something you could say, it's not that person's fault, that they even became, whatever you said, like kind of, someone else might say mooching off the system or freeloading, right? It's not their fault, right? Because if somebody created a system which they could survive in that environment, they're like a victim, because that sapped their own individual,
Well,
free will, ethic, in that sense.
maybe it is his fault, maybe it is not, but in a way it is irrelevant because
Right.
the system allows that behavior, and so someone is going to develop it. That's the
Right. I mean,
general point I was making. But what I wasn't very
right.
clear about with President Sunday, and the reason why I don't really want to get too bogged down in welfare as a topic is that it's going to be very complicated to differentiate, all the effects of welfare and
Right.
what kinds of welfare constitute free resources and what kinds of welfare constitute
Right.
something else, right? As a general rule,
Right.
if
It is a
society
vast topic. I
or the
agree.
majority gets something out of it, then it's not exactly like the self-defeating form of altruism that I was arguing against. Like I gave you the example in direct messages on Discord of healthcare, I think, right? Healthcare could be construed to be free resources because some of the people who pinch in do not benefit from it. But on some level, it is also just a form of insurance, right? A way to reduce variability in the randomness of day-to-day life. And we benefit from reducing variability. Everyone benefits from this.
Right.
Like a human
Right.
can
And at
live
some
with
point,
$1,000 a month, maybe depending on the place, right? But a human cannot live with $0 for a year and then 50,000 in December, right? So
right.
reducing the variation benefits the human in this case.
Right. 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 Yeah, you're
So
right. Welfare is a very vast topic, and it's very easy to lose the nuance. I kind of wanted to, though. I mean, so we can sidestep it now, but I thought the most interesting part of hearing you talk to both people was that I used to believe pretty strongly in UBI, Universal Basic Income. If we just give everyone $1,000 a month, that might be a good way to go around the holes that global capitalism, has created. And so, what you kind of made me realize, though, is that that might be a nightmare in terms of, and like you said, you don't want to extend the evolution too much to people, because they are human beings. Like, for example, like, I don't think there's any way you can reduce the amount of benefits someone gets per child, right? Even though that kind of encourages someone to get a few more, in food benefits, and I don't know how the rest of the programs work, but
right,
I feel like it's just kind of like, it's not a child's fault, so you can't ethically reduce someone's. If there's going to be an increase in benefits, it should be just
right.
across per people, right?
Well,
You can't.
you can't.
Kind of
Since we've spent so much time, fostering a population of dependent people, like now, if we wanted to go back on it, it would be very uncomfortable
right.
for those people. If you already have, I don't know, 5 kids on the dime, and suddenly all the benefits are cut, then yeah, you're making kids starve, and that's not exactly a crowd pleaser. I would never get elected on that platform.
Right.
And
I thought
well,
that was very astute too, because something that wasn't solidified enough. You're right. This is done because politicians enjoy votes, and we actually, something that I've had to concede. We do live in a very redistributionist society. We don't say it, but the fact that public school is offered, I mean, there's still a cost, but
right.
it's nominal, right, compared to how much private school costs.
I think if you wanted to find a solution to this, like to be able to get out of that trap without, in the most humane way that I can think of, you would have to to hop on the train as it goes. Accept the fact that some people have already had 5 kids on the dime, and you can't really cut benefits right now. But you would probably want to create some kind of a parental permit, something like that, which puts into place the condition that someone needs to have enough resources to get a permit, right, to have a child or something like that. And in this case, you don't need to do mass sterilization. You just need to make clear that if you don't have a parental permit and yet go through with your personal projects without using contraception, you can end up with sterilization. But this way, one, you don't have to do mass sterilization, which is not a crowd pleaser either, as President Sunday acutely observed. And two, you don't have to backpedal on the situation, but you can solve it for the future. I think that would probably be the most painless way to do it. Although, of course, there is no absolutely painless way to do it. But that is population control of the type, China installed for a few generations, which is not a very comfortable thing to do either for a population. But I think it's worth it because the alternative, right, is to grow and grow until we grow beyond our available resources, and then we're back to our Malthusian condition.
Malthusian is the word. I was at a symposium with Brian Greene, who's the physicist, and he pointed out that, yeah, we do have a lot of problems, but more people being born means also more people to solve problems. So he was a little more optimistic. But from my knowledge, though, like the global population is right now 7 billion. It's probably going to peak at 14 billion and then go down from there.
I have a whole line of argument against that. That is something that President Sunday mentioned towards the end of our discussion.
Okay, we're adding this.
Right. Which is that.
And then also, have you heard the argument that population decline will be more catastrophic than simply population growth, or overcapacity?
Well, population decline will never be very comfortable, right? You can either decline through disease, war, or famine, or reproduction control. I don't think
or negative, right? Negative growth rates, right? Yeah. For whatever reason, smaller family size is not enough to replenish the.
Right, which is the most comfortable one, and on the other hand, it can't grow forever. Because the initial argument of Malthus still stands, right? The population sort of grows geometrically, and the ability to increase our resources doesn't, or it can grow geometrically for a while, but there's no guarantee that we will be able to increase our available resources very fast for very long. And there is a guarantee that our resources are limited. Because, the Earth is just a ball of dirt, right?
Yeah, I mean, but libertarians, they argue that we keep getting better at scooping out that dirt.
Yeah, but there's a finite amount of dirt and a finite amount of surface to illuminate, to grow plants.
Right. I mean, not to be a technology isn't going to solve everything, but you could find ways to. I mean, you're right. Our crop cycle, we have less than 60 or 120 crop cycles left.
Right.
Because we've been farming and farming and farming. So
that's an admirable achievement, but the core argument is that you can't outpace exponential growth forever, and population grow exponentially. And there is one interesting counter argument to that, which is that in modernity, population growth tends to level off, right? You do observe a demographic transition, right? You've heard about the term, I presume. And well, the argument against it is that demographic transition doesn't take into account biological or cultural evolution, which is that right now, modernity has an effect. Yes, depresses the fertility of the people who enter it and who live in it, like mostly due to widely available contraceptives, I assume, but also due to education and things like that. But this is an environment. If the environment is stable, people are going to be progressively optimized to reproduce better in that environment. And so, yeah, the demographic transition is a thing, but the demographic transition theory, which predicts that this low fertility pattern is stable and will remain the same, is wrong, because it will just stay that way until, well, in the case of France, for instance, for the time it takes for the trad Catholics to replace the atheists, for instance. That is a form of cultural evolution as well. Or but even in the absence of culture, you could do this with biology. You could have a very adaptive allergy to the birth control pill, for instance. It would take a lot more time, but it would happen. We have enough people and enough generations to go before extinction. So yeah, I don't think there's a way to escape the fact that as long as we have abundance, we will have an exponential growth of population, and that at some point, since the resources are limited, the curves are going to cross. And Malthus's initial observation stands that at that point, the only things that can limit a population are disease, famine, and war. And we've eliminated disease, so it's going to be famine or war. I mean, I told you that is not pleasant to hear.
Yeah, I have a very unpleasant thought sometimes. It's like when, people smear Bill Gates, but I remember like he was handing out like free nets, in countries with malaria, because you can reduce the child mortality rate just by sleeping under a net. And like
Right.
he figured out that like the number one way you can reduce, and I'm like, well, if a country's poor and doesn't have enough resources, you kind of want a higher mortality rate, right? Just because, and like it's horrible to think about, like obviously you would want, your child to be under a net. I don't have children, but it's like, but when you think about it from like a global policy kind of standpoint, it's kind of weird to like
Yeah.
kind of, but
Well, Nathan's point about killing baby and how it is instinctively horrendous for us to think about is true, but it's also not quite true. And I should have answered that to him, because if we really, really wanted to, kill babies or limit population that way, we'd find a way to call those babies differently and call the process of killing them differently. So we'd probably call them fetuses or something like that and call it an abortion. I am not against abortion, but you
yeah,
have
for
to
example,
recognize that the difference
for
is arbitrary.
wildlife, we use the word culling. We cull elephants. Like there's only a certain amount of elephants that can live in a reserve park, so they
Right.
have to, just euthanize it, and then they put it in a shredder, and they sell the ivory because that's money too. So it's like it's a necessary, like you can have a rehabilitation project that's like too successful, right? Because it doesn't take
Mhm.
long for animals to reproduce. But I mean, continue. You were saying.
No, I think on the subject of population growth, I was done. I
You
can
know,
talk about my motivations a bit if you're curious, because that is one thing I didn't convey very well in my
sure, yeah,
discussion with President
please.
Sunday.
Mhm.
So, did you listen to the conversation with Meat Machine?
No, I
The
didn't.
one on Nathan's, yeah, it was a bit.
That's what you were talking to him about at the beginning. I remember that.
Right, yeah. He mentioned that he was a nihilist and a person who with no fundamental values, something like that. And I think, well, in this stream, maybe not, but usually the argument is quite sound, right? Even though you're probably not going to agree to this with being religious and all, but I think as a non-believer, the argument is quite sound that you have no foundation. Essentially, I'm saying that the religious people who, when you tell them you are an atheist, they go, "Oh well, you have no morals and you have no foundations for values and something like that." They are actually right.
I think I remember
And
this now. This was another live conversation, right? That Nathan had.
right, yeah, I mentioned it briefly.
Okay. Now I know who you're talking about. Okay,
Right.
I do remember this now. Go ahead. Sorry.
So yeah, as you dig deeper and deeper, you find that you have no foundation, and you kind of have to build it. Because you can't really exist without making decisions, without making choices, right? And so in order to make a choice, you have to have an intention, and an intention is given its direction by a value. So you need some kind of value. So you have a choice between having those ad hoc, intuitive, instinctive values that you didn't choose and have sort of a rational system of values, right? So I sort of chose, not exactly arbitrarily, but I chose to have self-preservation as a value, a fundamental value, you could say, which includes the preservation of my descent and which includes having a descent as well. And so I guess you could say this is my fundamental value. And I've been made aware that something like 80% of the world population can only exist thanks to modern agriculture, right? And well, I think modernity and modern agriculture, by extension, is made very unstable by a number of factors, such as nuclear weapons and population growth, but also dysgenics, limited energy resources, and environmental destruction, for instance. So, if modern civilization goes
Sorry.
down
What
for
was the
any of
first
these
thing?
reasons,
What was the
uh,
first thing you said? Dysgenics? Genics?
I think I said nuclear weapons, the first thing I said, and then population growth, and then dysgenics. Yes, the opposite of eugenics. Like that's the freeloader problem that we were discussing. That's an example of dysgenics.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's a loaded term, but
Okay,
it's
go on.
a useful term, I guess, is what I'm saying. It encapsulates well what I'm talking about. Um,
Sorry,
and
go ahead.
well, so yeah, if modern civilization collapses, like 80% of the population goes with it, presumably. And I don't like the idea of my descendants having to go through such a filter. So that is my rationale for supporting peace and pragmatism in the case of nuclear weapons, but also supporting eugenics in the case of dysgenics. My version of eugenics, which like should absolutely take into account the fact that it's been tried before and not very well. Also population control and also a form of energy management. Like we need something for fossil fuels. We need to manage fossil fuels and environmental protection. And all of these need to be made worldwide, right? Which requires some kind of a world government, like some sort, right? And well, that's my rationale from it. But as I discussed in our direct message discussion on Discord, I have no illusion about my chances of persuading
Right,
people of
right.
these things. So I'm mostly discussing non-trivial topics because
Mm-hmm.
that's what I like, right?
Mm-hmm. No,
um,
I mean, I think it's valuable to appreciate truth, even if it might be a little loaded. Um, but also, like, as long as some, like, also we all have a gauge for when something is a cover, for something else. So it kind of like you said at the beginning, like I'm just speaking from an evolutionary standpoint. Like you're telling me now, like it's not like you're going to be able to convince a public that this is a great idea, or a country per se. Um, but I think there's value. Like when you're right, you're right. If we had some kind of like intelligence applied to world resources, their distribution, and also population. Like for example, it's not good either way, right? When you have too much population accelerating beyond your employment ability, right? Let's say your ability to churn, because we know developing economies grow fast, right? And then developed economies, you're lucky if you get 4% a year. Um, and so um, it makes too much sense, and I feel like there's sci-fi shows that show it, where like the UN kind of has more jurisdiction, but that's only because like sea levels are so crazy high,
Hmm.
that like we've had to like appropriate billions like globally. And also most people are on universal basic insurance in the Expanse, which takes place like 100 years from now or so. So and by the way, like even though like it's a promise that they'll give like like a living sustenance wage, it's actually pretty terrible. Like people, they don't have access to good water or good food, um, even though supposedly there's a global safety net. Like
Hmm.
the safety net is kind of like pretty awful. Like so,
Well,
yeah,
I don't know about those examples because, pardon me for mentioning this, but it's from fiction, right?
yeah. But I'm just saying,
Um,
though, it could be a dystopia very easily. In
that
ways
is
where
true, yeah.
you start out
But
saying like this is
well,
going to be a utopia where we imagine like there's going to be a global safety net, and then
yeah,
you
any
get
decision is going to be taken in regards of its expected consequences, and we don't know whether it's going to bring about a dystopia or a better world. But what I do know is that the alternative has a lot of potential to be worse. Like the alternative is really really bad.
do
Like
nothing. Yeah,
yeah, and doing nothing is a choice. Even though you could argue that there is no collective agency for humanity as a whole right now, so it's not really a choice, right? But since we could conceivably have collective agency in the form of a government, um, well, I think we should. Because some of those things are um, a bit like tragedies of the commons, right? What with
right,
all those countries,
right.
if one country starts to voluntarily limit their population, they risk not being competitive with the neighboring countries, and so they can't really do that without risking, having well, being invaded or something like that. Even though nowadays we have pretty good worldwide cooperation to prevent wars, but this is also well, I think the idea of a tragedy of the idea of the tragedy of the commons comes from ecology, right? And that is a very good example. And this is one part of the problem where we don't have worldwide cooperation. We are trying, but sorry to say that the United States are defecting at every turn. For instance, they're not the only ones, of course, but for instance, the attempts, right, to limit carbon emissions are never really espoused by everyone. But
Right. It's
it's
a
like
worthless piece
the
of paper for the most part. Yeah.
right. The definition of a tragedy of the commons because
There's no
like
teeth,
everyone
right,
pays the bill, but
in
you
these
have a choice
agreements.
not to contribute. You can get the benefits without without paying the contribution. So of course you have an
And like
incentive to defect to
countries
do that.
set the quotas themselves, so it's like, okay.
Do they? All right.
Yeah. Yeah,
I'm not
that's
very
the
familiar with
that's
it.
the, yeah, that's the thing in the Paris Accords too. It's like, like there's a certain expectation that they're all going to
Hmm.
lower it, but like each country sets its own goals, and then it tells you whether it meets those goals or not.
Well, that is a terrible policy. We should change it. I did not know that. Oh well.
Yeah. or I think that was Kyoto, and I think Paris was kind of a little bit more rigorous in that regard. So Kyoto was kind of, well, I mean, the U.S. didn't even sign Kyoto, so that's kind of
That
that's
was
also
a kind of a gratuitous jab, to be honest.
it was there's
You deserve better.
it's interesting. I'm glad we're kind of in here because the first thing is like here's where I'm coming from. Here's where I kind of found you to be kind of valuable to what I'm to me, in the sense that I used to believe in Ayn Rand, and I used to believe that like, look, this is what I used to tell my friends: if everyone hauled their own ass, we'd be fine, right? Like, and it's something cruel to say because actually I realize now how many people are actually like are on any kind of social security disability or something like that, and you don't want to put people out on the street, but putting aside the people who actually need something, right? Like life sustaining support because they're not able to provide for themselves. But, and so I used to, I feel like I made a 180 in the sense that also I was unemployed myself, by the way, for about 5 years after college. So I graduated in '08. And like
Young.
I worked odd jobs, like I worked but with a college degree, I didn't have anything to study. The economy had collapsed the same year that I graduated, so it wasn't good timing. So I was working off the books,
Right.
and there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm just, like, I mean, it's honest work. But I wondered how long that was gonna last. It was actually very difficult for my life, even though you can make pretty good money if you're not paying taxes.
Right. That's psychologically very
Yeah, exactly.
difficult, to be in that situation.
Yeah, chronically unemployed. And so like, and that's the thing, you lose faith or hope that you could even get a job. So like it's pretty crippling. I always have empathy, especially in this time with the global pandemic. So when I transformed, and even religiously also, I kind of became far more Christian than I was initially. Um, when I transformed, I also swung quite naturally to the left, because where I'm coming from is, first, Ayn Rand in her novel, her perfect utopian capitalist novel, there is no such thing as a gift. So like, even the heroine, when she stays in the hero's house, she like, makes his bed and cleans his house and cooks him breakfast or whatever. And so it's like, well, I'm not going to stay in your house for free. So it's kind of weird, somebody that, you're intimate friends with, or you're a lover with, that they would expect payment for like sleeping in your house or something. Like, I mean, that would be, I'd
It's
owe a lot of,
usually implicit, right?
I'd owe a
The
lot of
payment
money.
comes in the form of like the payment is not usually a transaction, right? It's
Right.
companionship and
Yeah, it's
things
a
like
joy
that.
to have you
It's a
with your,
compensation, but it's not exactly a payment.
right. And when you said you said there would be altruism between yourself and your offspring, and perhaps your close kin, because you would want them, because that's you, and you would want them to survive. And so I was jumping out around in the chat because I didn't realize you were so reasonable. But where I'm coming from is, well, first, theologically, everything is a gift. And it's funny for me, like, I understand, like, so for a capitalist, you take a tree and you chop it down, that's labor. Now you've turned it into wood. And then a carpenter has turned it into a table. So now you've added value. So now that thing costs like $700, even though it was like a worthless tree in the forest before. So like, human effort and intelligence has turned that into something with value. Or even like a $20 IKEA table, whatever it is. Uh, so it's a beautiful thing, because yes, obviously nothing is free in that regard, right? Like, but we live in a world where overproduction is the norm. Like, inflation is like 4% every year, so, or 2% at least. And so if we're lucky. And so that comes from also, like, they produce a lot of goods. Like, I've even seen like pictures of bicycles that they've thrown away in China, and they're all like the you know when a city buys bicycles and they're supposed to lock into place and they're kind of heavy because they all have like a color on them or like a collar or like a
Yeah.
plastic shell on them. So I've seen like tens of thousands of bikes thrown away in a mountain in China, like by a forest in China,
Well,
because
if you're arguing that we are collectively kind of idiots, I have nothing to argue against.
right.
I
So
do think we're very wasteful, and that humans are kind of short-term optimizers, and that we've adapted to our modern environment very well, very rapidly, right? And so now that it's a free for all, we are just extremely wasteful, not realizing that scarcity is
right.
just around the corner. At least that's my point of view.
Yeah. So thanks for giving me that. So I mean to kind of short the my idea. Like I remember having a discussion with a doctor once who was just trying to feel me out, and but you know he was trying to sell me like there's no such thing as a free lunch, and 100%, you know, the economists say that, but we're very good at getting more and more from very little, you know. So we're at the point almost, or we're about there, where we have enough production to provide for everyone, including the growth rate. And argue, I mean, but yeah, I'll pause there.
We could provide for everyone for a time, yes. I
Right
don't
now, yeah,
disagree with that.
yeah, but for the
Um,
future, we're in trouble.
well, yeah,
I
in
think
deep
you're right.
trouble, and
I
unless
think
we
you're right.
curb the growth rate. And well, if we want to provide food for everyone and to make um, that kind of a poverty disappear and have a welfare for the people who are handicapped and such, we can do it. We just need, well, as I said in the present Sunday video, we just need the feedback loop. We just need to prevent, like, we can alleviate the problem if we prevent the problem from growing. Like, if we prevent the, um, yeah, well, I think you get my point. I don't know
I
how
do.
to phrase that very well.
But so the funny thing, I was trying to, I realized a point I had before too. So it would require countries to be somewhat altruistic for like the greater benefit, and so that's the funny
No,
part,
it's not altruism, it's cooperation.
where
Because
it's
we only
cooperation.
do this because we realize that, sorry, we realize that if we don't do it, we're fucked. So it's cooperation in the sense of a common threat, but it's
Right,
almost as good, to be
which is
fair.
more of a long-sighted thing, also, right? You also need to be long-sighted to be
Mm,
cooperative.
right.
So both values are like you're kind of admitting, right? It's highly questionable if we have enough of that.
I didn't quite get that part, sorry.
Do we have enough of cooperation, and do we have enough of um, long-term sightedness to undergo this?
I don't think so.
Yeah,
I think as far as cooperation is concerned, we don't have the mechanisms in place. Although we could, it's not, as an engineering problem, it's not too complicated. Like, we could have a world government. We already have the United Nations, for instance. Um, I mean, we just need some kind of a police force, right? Some kind of an intervention force that is significant and a counterweight to those of small states, something like that. And as far as what was the other thing besides cooperation? Yeah, long-sightedness, right? This is a bit more, yeah, complicated because it relies on people and what they are and how they think and how the process that selects our leaders is defined, right? Because if we have a process in place, such as democracy, that selects for leader according to their ability to persuade people, we're going to get leaders that are very good at persuading, but not leaders that are very good at long-term thinking, for instance, right? So I don't know how to solve that problem. I don't know how to
yeah,
make democracies better. I don't know if
yeah.
we need to write them off,
I
but
give
I'm
a
not.
critique. Also, financial corporations, they publish their quarter or their profits quarterly, and like they're bought and sold based on that. It's like, is it really great to run a global economy and tens of trillions of dollars on just like how much money I made in 3 months. Like, shouldn't you be thinking like, is this company going to be stable? Is this market going to be stable for like 10 years? Like,
Right.
wouldn't it
You
be
should
more
absolutely
valuable?
think long term if you can. Yeah. Although, yeah, there's.
And like, that's why you get frauds, right? Because it's like the drive is to every quarter, did you make more money? Like every, because and then everyone goes based on that.
Well, there are certainly ways to optimize the system, but even a clunky, non-perfect system is better than no system at all, surely. So even if you tried to do it and it had a lot of corruption and it barely worked, I'd take it. It's better than losing 80% of the populations, including among them my kids.
So you wouldn't buy that we're past, like, with enough technology we can, for example, I mean, not to be, I don't want to minimize, like, I think it's an important point, and I probably have to chew on it more, but there's a theory that we could eat insect exoskeletons to get our protein. We're coming out with
Well, I'm
artificial
sure we
meat.
can find. Sorry to interrupt. I'm sure we could find plenty of very original ideas to stave off the problem, but at the end of the day, it's an energy problem. It's like how much. Just sorry, the matter we eat like can be converted to energy, and to produce it, we need a certain amount of energy, and the energy that the plants use to grow comes from the sun, and it's at a certain distance, and it's shining on a certain surface, and we are not going to get more of it, even though we can optimize everything, but at the end of the day, it's an energy limit. And I mean, we have sort of.
Let me cut you off
Go
there.
ahead.
Everything is limited. Like I said, soil cycles, depletion, too much fertilizer, how much cow manure can we make, and like how much can we pump into that. Also, I know, for example, my city, New York, 8 million people, all of our waste, most of it is treated, but whatever is not treated is just pumped out into the ocean, and there's like a long pipeway and another long pipeway that takes it out a mile or two out from the water, but it just all goes into the ocean, and like you wonder how much more could like our planet sustain
Well, but
if like.
you emit part of the energy you absorbed in the form of heat, and that is not recuperated, and that will not never be recycled. Like humans sort of require an energy input to sustain their metabolism. Any life form does. But
Yeah, but so the reason I cut you off is, so the one thing that's not limited is the sun. Like the sun is I mean, in the sense that like it's always going to be
right,
slanting energy into us. I mean, you're
right.
the
But
you're
the
the
rate at which it slams energy into us is limited,
not. I
and
mean,
we consume that energy at a certain rate. And if there
okay.
is twice as many of us, we consume it at twice the rate.
I think with nuclear power we'll be all right. I mean, in this, and also all these alternatives, like just, I mean, the solar power is a lot. Like, I mean, I don't want
It is
to. I
quite
don't
a
want to throw
lot.
this. Yeah, I don't want to throw the science textbook at you, but like, I think it's like a couple of thousand gigajoules that like beat down on the Earth every day.
It's a lot, but it's not going to be enough to outpace exponential growth, because exponential growth is like a fixed doubling time. And in the
I mean, you
like
see, I'm
sorry to say that
sorry.
in the 20th century, the world population has doubled every 25 years.
Oh yeah, it's crazy.
So a doubling time of 25 years means that in the span of 300 years, for example, like how much is that?
I mean,
It's
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 like you said, it's exponential
yeah, 2 to the power of
because
12,
like
right?
how quickly we got to a billion, and then how quickly we got to 2 billion, 3 billion,
So,
4 billion. It was like for 20 years team
so if we
between.
kept that growth rate, we will multiply the population by 4,000 in 300 years. Do you
Look,
think then that would be a problem?
yeah, it would be, but hang on. Let me hold on. Let me find two things, and I'm just gonna pause my cam. But I feel like, okay, so for example, I'm from India, and the illiteracy rate when India became a country independent in 1948 was like 60, like 90%, I don't know, and now it's only about 33%. So in like 60 years, for you to beat back illiteracy, it's pretty good. And so the idea would be when they're more literate, um, they're here we go. So when they're more literate, so India's population growth rate is at 1%.
Right.
This year in 1974, it was 2.36%. In 2020, India will add 13 million people, 13.6 to the population, close to the
Mhm.
population of Somalia. So we already see like that's nothing compared to what the rates were for India and China back in the 70s.
Right. That's
So
why we started by discussing demographic transition theory and how the prediction that it makes that this pattern of low fertility is going to be stable is only right as long as humans are not quote unquote adapted to modernity.
okay, but you don't see how like living in a nice suburban thing with like now college to pay for and a mortgage to pay for, that might make people want to have less kids. And because the alternative, right, was that you lived in an agricultural economy where you needed 12 kids to help you on the farm. And now that we don't have farms anymore, they naturally choose. But I'm not familiar with the theory per se. I've seen slideshows, and
That's the thing,
I've
right? Some
I've done
people
basic
manage it.
math.
Like the typical middle class person in the US might have the kind of lifestyle that you described, but some people have a very different lifestyle with a much higher fertility rate. And you don't need to go all the way to the Amish, but very close to where you live, I think there are communities of Orthodox Jews, for instance, which has a lot of kids, and they live in an urban environment, right? So it's
Yeah.
definitely possible. So if it is possible, there is a niche, and so people will adapt. Like I think the most direct takeaway that you can take from this is that in New York, in the generations to come, there will be a smaller percentage of the population that is represented by the people you described, and a greater share of the population would be the Orthodox Jews that I just mentioned, right? And so you can see how this New York population will not keep this low fertility pattern for very long, because it doesn't take long to get to a majority. If each couple has 5 kids, they multiply by 2.5 every generation. And this is not a polemic against Orthodox Jews, of course.
Yeah, no, I see
They're
what you're
just
saying.
they're
It's
just
just
adaptive in a
like
sense,
time is on your side. So
right?
yeah, I mean certainly what's happening in Israel, right? Like the secular people were the ones who founded the country,
Right,
and now the Orthodox parties are kind of running the country just because they vote as a bloc, and
right.
the
And
liberals and
Israel is an even worse example because it's a desert. It's a place with very limited resources.
um,
I know that's depressing. I'm sorry about it.
no, it's
Yeah,
it's very true because like I mean, like I said, I thought of the Israeli example myself. Um, even like and there, I mean, there's other reasons too. Like they've had Russian immigrants come in from the Soviet Union, like over a
mhm.
million when the Soviet Union collapsed, and so they tend to vote a little bit hawkish anyway too. So it's not just the Orthodox demographics. But
Right.
it's also true. For example, in the 80s or 70s, we thought Reform Judaism or Conservative Judaism, which is more liberal, was going to win the day, right? Just because we had so many famous theologians. But it turned out that Orthodox Judaism is like um,
It's a very good adaptation to modernity. And in the case of France, I don't think we have too many Orthodox Jews, but we do have, for instance, trad Catholics, which are also very well adapted to modernity because they have, like, those are the Catholics which do not recognize Vatican II, right? And so they have a ban on contraceptives. And this is a very good trait to have in modernity, a very good
okay,
adaptation.
right? But hold on. I mean, you know what? I'm very familiar with this wing of online Catholicism.
Right.
So
It's not only online, though. I know a few of those.
yeah,
I've been
yeah,
to
yeah.
a baptism in downtown Paris uh,
I
of
mean,
trad Catholics. It's impressive.
they were like occupying a cathedral in Paris for like
Yeah, yeah,
a good
the
while. Yeah,
Saint Nicholas Cathedral. It's still
yeah,
ongoing.
yeah, and that,
Crazy,
but
crazy shit.
there's the SSPX. There's seminaries in Nicole, Switzerland. So it's
Right.
like it's they're thriving. They're thriving. Um, their masses are famously full, right? Like, um,
Hmm.
but what the reason I interrupted you though was to say like, if you ask 99% of people, like, are you okay with contraception? They'd say like, yeah, I'm okay with it. So, we can have like these fringe um sects, right? And like I understand what you're saying, that over time, like, we may see the atheists get supplanted by the traditionalists, just the way numbers work.
Right.
But
Well, it wouldn't take that long for a population to grow out of control just due to these small minorities in Western countries. But at the scale of the world, we have some regions that are very well adapted to modernity as well, and don't seem to have had too much of a hit to their fertility due to it. And it's probably cultural as well. And well, but that's just the
you
same
know,
kind of issue, right? Just on a different scale.
yeah, I mean,
I mean, it's as sad for them as it is for us.
I don't. But
It's not.
here's something. Here's I don't know how to say this. Okay, so I was almost convinced by traditional Catholicism, and it was actually that point where Vatican II, post Vatican II, the Church endorses a form of contraception known as uh, taking a
Abstinence?
taking a measurement of the woman's body temperature, and from there you can tell the most fertile periods, and then the
All
Catholic
right.
couple has intercourse when the woman is not fertile, and you reduce your chances of pregnancy by like 90%. And they'll tell you it's like 95.5, and then they'll round it up to like 96 or 99.
Hmm.
But look, you're guessing, right? So at the same time, you're open to life. Um, so I remember thinking that was such an interesting
Such a
theology,
cope.
because as a modern person, I've never. So it's funny that you're calling these groups like well adapted to modernity. To me, these are the groups that are least adapted to modernity.
Well,
But
they are the ones who are rejecting it, but also the ones who are adapted in an evolutionary sense.
right,
And
right, right.
I
I
just
got
wanted to get something out of the way as well. I am talking here about cultural evolution as an analogy to um, biological evolution. I think you get that point because you didn't object to it, but it's not the same thing. And I think a lot of people watching if there are a lot of people to begin with. Um, I think a lot of people watching will get this wrong, but the reason I am able to make this comparison is because there is an analogy between biology and, to borrow Dawkins' term, memetics, right? You have like
Yes.
those mimetic complexes,
Genes
and
transmit information, genetic information. Memes transmit mental, memetic information.
right. So this information can reproduce from mind to mind, quote unquote reproduce, right? And then mutate, and then will be selected for its ability to persuade, essentially,
Right. It's
or
an
to
analogy.
get transmitted. But in the case of some of these mimetic complexes, which are mostly transmitted from parents to children, such as religions, they are not only selected to be transmissible, they are also selected to favor the fertility of the people who transmit them. Because
Right.
the more kids you have, the more the mimetic complex will spread, right? So they will naturally, over time, develop things like which we see in large religions, right? They will develop things like, you know, encouraging fertility, encouraging to have big families, like disapproving of contraception.
Right.
These types of things
Or
are very common,
illegitimate children or whatnot. Yeah.
right? Or homophobia, for instance.
Right.
If you have a child and you force him to marry regardless of what he wants, you are more likely to have grandchildren, regardless of
Right.
whether or not it's nice to him to do such a thing.
And right. And it's funny. I learned within the past year that actually the genetic information that's swapped when you have the gametes mix is actually that of the grandparents. Like it's of each of of your parents that's swapped. It's not your DNA per se. It's the part that's the half of your parents. And because like your own DNA splits in half. So
Right.
it's not your thing that's transmitted. It's actually your parents. And so that's probably why like grandparents are just as much invested, if not more, in their children
Hmm.
than parents are.
Yeah, there is some shenanigans in how related you are to your grandparents as compared to your parents. An
Yeah.
interesting thing is that you're exactly 50% related to your parents, for instance, or to your kids, and but the relationship you have with the siblings is not actually 50%. It's from 0 to 100 with an average of 50, because you could conceivably have exactly the same halves, right? Exactly the same chromosome halves as a sibling. So you could have, theoretically, even though it never happens, a perfect twin that is born 10 years after you.
Right.
That is a
Nearly.
weird thing. Yeah,
Yeah, it
nearly
is.
perfect. Mm.
Right, but like you said, that comes from the grandparents' genetic information being swapped, not the parents.
Right.
Yeah, like you said, you could have a sibling that you're like bare like only 1% related to, even though you do have the same parents. In fact,
Mm. Right.
um,
I find your stances on biology like very realistic for someone who is, pardon me to say that, a theist, right? And I find it very unusual because evolution, or familiarity with evolution, I should say, tends to drive people towards atheism, because it sort of conflicts with a lot of religious narratives, although not all of them, but some of them. And it's often enough to like make people like, it doesn't demonstrate atheism, but it makes people lean towards it.
yeah,
Surely you would
and
agree
people
about that.
conflate the two big time, like
Right.
right, and evolution haters tend to be, you know, religious. Um, yeah, it's something, but it's interesting because when I was a more right wing Republican, I actually was against evolution, and it's probably from like being in the political circles. But forgive me for saying this, right? So I hope you're saying, seated. But it's like, to me, when I see evolution, I just see the multiplicity of God's creation in that sense. Like I know, you know, it's kind of it's amazing how, because what's kind of, like, I mean, I don't like Jordan Peterson, but when he talks about, I think he was talking about lobsters once, and people laugh at him a lot for this speech, but I thought like there was something interesting about it in the sense that, like, I think the whole discussion, because I did watch that one, was that like our consciousness took probably the same 4 billion years to evolve. So like there's a part of us that we inherited, from the lobster, or like our last common ancestor. And so like there's a single celled organism, and we share like that same electricity and the same warmth with that, single celled organism. And so I don't know, I feel like evolution is like a very mystical thing in a way that like I
Yeah,
share the same code.
it has poetic elements in a sense. Yeah, I guess I can see that because
Even the
it's kind of
shape
a
is
neat
like pretty
theory.
pretty
It's
neat.
one of the
Yeah.
pretty tree-like. Yeah, it's I think it's among the theories that we have that have the lowest amount of assumptions and the highest amount of explanatory power. So in a sense, it's a very seductive theory. It's a very psychologically attractive theory,
Yeah. And
which is a way to say it's beautiful.
yeah, it really is. Um yeah, and so the other, also like I received I went to public school, and I don't know, maybe it's the last good public school I went to, like that generation, because we had to actually learn multiplication tables and memorize them. Um but it's like, first of all, learning science, like there's a order to our universe, and you know it's like, I don't know, it just helps. But then I remember, like, so I grew up in New York, and a lot of my teachers were Jewish, and so they were also Orthodox, like you pointed out. So they never taught us to see a conflict, and like obviously you can't preach religion too much, but I remember I had a Jewish earth science teacher, and he said, like, well, how do we know how long a day was? Just because the book of Genesis tells us the world was created in 6 days. So the fact that you could have a poetic understanding of 6 day creation, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's, so I'm really grateful actually that I had science teachers, and also science teachers who, because I mean, like, I actually posed this to Richard Dawkins too, because I read once he doesn't like to be brought up of scientists who are theists, right? Because it's like, well, because he claims to be speaking for science when he says, well, of course there's no theism involved, but at the same
Right.
time, when you
He's
bring
got
up
a chip on his shoulder with
a little
this,
bit,
which is
and he grew up
not
in
his best
Kenya.
work, to be honest.
He grew up in Kenya, but you know what? I have a lot of respect for him. So like you said, the selfish gene. Like everybody should read that. The word meme comes from Richard Dawkins. Like advertising culture, modern Pepe. The frog and everything. That all is thanks to Richard Dawkins. So I have a lot of respect for even someone who, like. And the other thing is, like, if you first, like, you should understand somebody so you could explain it to them. Like, so I have a lot of appreciation for the naturalist worldview. um and I love naturalists. Like, they're really cool people. Like, I mean, I was trying to explain to someone what naturalism was, and I said, it's like,
How do you define naturalist?
yeah,
Sorry.
it's hard because there's a contemporary. So I said, it's someone who lives in the Congo rainforest, and they live among the gorillas for like 20 years, and they keep journals in their like wooden shack along the top, filled with observations about everything the gorillas do.
All right.
So th- that's the original term. So it's kind of a 19th century colonial kind of
Right.
thing
With
too.
the hard hat.
No,
Okay.
but so like the thing is that there's no God involved, but like you are trying to understand the world, nature, and like, for example, we don't have botany as a subject, right? But it's kind of like, I remember in the 60s when my parents are growing up, like they had botany. So it's kind of cool to like have,
Yeah, it sounds cozy.
what I'm saying? So it's like people used to have like that kind of naturalist worldview was like, okay, well, we know plants, we know animals. Like I remember, so my biology teacher, and later became life science by the time we learned it again for junior high school or high school. Um, what my biology teacher told me that in the 60s he had to memorize 100 names of 100 animals in Latin nomenclature. So Felix Pantherus and all that. So, but either like so you had a firm grasp on the world that you lived in, and when you dumb down the curriculum, you kind of lose something. So I really even no matter what your theology or philosophy winds up being, you should have actually a rigorous understanding of these subjects.
That's a very humanist point of view in the original sense of humanist, right? The people from the 16th century who insisted, no matter your creed, on having a wide array of knowledge. And I think there is a lot of merit to it as well.
So
of living by that principle.
yeah, I definitely, and it was originally religious humanism as taught by the Catholic Church. That was like the first of that movement. And also the 16th century and onward, because they discovered the New World, and so it was kind of shocking for them because you're supposed to preach the gospel, but you have two continents full of people who had never heard the gospel.
Right.
So theologically, they had to like wrap their mind around that, like what happens to them, and like what God punishes
Yeah,
them on.
that's gonna make you take a huge humble pill as well. When you're sure about everything, and then you just find a goddamn new continent. I assume that will, throw a big stone in the lake of your worldview, right? And make quite a lot of ripples.
Yeah, and actually, so last night also I was watching about the revolutions of 1848, which were, and I only kind of learned about them, and I was doing better now, but so the thing is that the the countries had kind of agreed. Well, they freed the slaves too, in the far distant colonies, but oh, sorry. So the church too, it became a little bit more liberal in its thought because okay, so this is the funny thing. So if you were a radical, if you believe power should be held in like the cafes, you know how, the revolutionaries they plot in like cafes, so and then you were a liberal if you thought power should be in parliaments, and then you were a conservative if you thought power should be with the monarchy. And so eventually the liberals won, right? More or less, like with Bismarck giving power to the parliament, more or less. And so the church too, it kind of had to like acknowledge workers' rights and kind of like acknowledge the rights of the state. And so like, and sorry, the other things, I remember downloading this thing. It was about how French novels kind of introduced individualism, and it's like the aristocracy had time to read novels, and also like you had time to worry about yourself. And so before a certain time period, people were not even individualistic. So it's funny. So traditional Catholicism, or even like radical Sedevacantists, they owe their thanks to the Enlightenment because that's the beginning of think for yourself thinking. And yet the theology they espouse is supposed to be, why are we in communion with the Vatican? It's because we get our theology from Rome, and we would never dissent from Rome. But like they dissent from Rome, even though, the whole purpose of, 2,000 years of thinking was because, not everyone could read scripture. We need to have a single source of authority. So it's ironic that you have this split in what's supposed to be like a universal faith.
They have sort of espoused the form of what they didn't quite like to begin with, right?
Yeah,
that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, they're pretty enlightened. I mean, I just realized that when I was reading about the rise of the novel and like how novels had like individual characters that thought for themselves, and that was like a French aristocratic thing, and it never really, and it's 21st century, we're so inculcated in an individualistic lifestyle. Like, of course I can choose
Right.
for myself who I
Maybe that
marry.
has to do actually with the fact that we are sort of living aristocratic lifestyles, right? Because we have a lot of free time and a lot of food on our plates for the most part.
Oh yeah, you can eat
Maybe
steak
that's
every
why
night,
it's.
potatoes. Yeah,
Hmm.
it wouldn't cost much, right? Because we have mass agriculture. But yeah, and we
All
have
right.
the leisure time to pursue philosophy and things like that. Middle
And
class
in
people.
winter, you're not cold. And if
Yeah,
you wish to find friends who are interested in philosophy, you don't have to like go to the big city. You can just need to get an internet connection.
right. Yeah, and like most, that's a brand new thing for like most people,
Right.
and it's and what you see happen online to religion is you have I mean for me, like when I because I was exposed to e-Catholicism in that sense, like the
Right.
traditionalism, and so online, because you're anonymous, you can be even more toxic. So like you can openly hate Jews. Like I was
Right.
reading, like Marie Le Pen, she has to go on this diabolization policy to, like we're not gonna say something as
Right.
rude, but like even though we may think it at rallies or whatnot, but
Hmm.
so it's the same way. So like on its public face, you can't have too much anti-Semitism, but like online, you see what happens. Like how
Right.
much.
Part of it ties back into what we were saying about the fact that mimetic systems are selected to transmit, right? To transmit more and more efficiently. And since social media is sort of well, it's a medium, right? It's a place where mimetic systems can transmit and
Yeah, it's a
transmit like
two-way
tens and tens
two-way
of that.
medium.
So it's sort of an accelerated mutation rate, an accelerated evolution of it, which is probably part of the reason why we have so many crowd manias and crazy movements popping up left and right.
Yeah, and
I think
also like global
it's
music
got to do.
videos,
It's got
like
something to
Gangnam
do with
Style.
the yeah, that too. Yeah, although this
Yeah,
is more innocuous, but
right. But
it's got
it's the
something to
same
do with the
medium.
monkey brain interacting with this completely new environment, with this completely unexplored social environment, I suppose. Hey, I've been meaning to ask you also, how did you reconcile the what you told me in DM, although maybe this is a bit private, I don't know, the thing about Ayn Rand and Salafism, how that work? How does that work?
Yeah. Well,
Sorry, this is a bit of a siege, but
no,
I
no,
was just
it's
curious.
fine. It's just I have a thesis kind of on it. So if you look at Ryan's worldview, she puts religious people in the same boat as communists. And the reason for that is she's a Nietzschean, right? So she says that mystics of the mind, they will tell you like, oh, just give us money and you'll go to heaven, and don't worry about your senses. We're sending you to heaven, right? So they like delude people with this fantasy. And mystics of the muscle are the communists. Like, oh well, don't worry about how much hard work it takes to make a table. We'll just take from the rich and we'll give everyone a table, and we'll just do that forever. And so they confiscate. They take people's money, and power, based upon that, deceiving people. So I kind of do a little bit of jujitsu on her. I said, well, say anybody who's a materialist is an atheist in that sense, right? Like, okay. And then, therefore, religious people who use theology to seize power, they're really materialists because they're in it for, the worldly power. And if you were
Hmm.
really a religious person, you'd be a mystic. And like St. Francis of Assisi, you would renounce all material power and and money, especially. Um, so to me,
As an
like,
instrumental goal, sort of, right? to
Well,
towards.
I mean, I don't. I mean, it's funny because, like, for example, like, like I have another YouTube channel with like 100 subscribers. Okay, so it's like, um, it's easy for me to say somebody who's nobody, right? Like, admittedly nobody. Yeah, I don't have any followers or anything that. Okay, well, what I say is the truth. I don't care about what anyone else says, right? But like you said, there's an environment in the social media thing. So like I often wonder, for example, you could talk about. I mean, I remember reading something about Hitler, but you could extend it to any contemporary politician, especially those who are recently out of office. But it's like you could just wonder, like maybe Hitler started out just talking about the humiliation Germany had, right? Or his experience as a veteran of World War One. And then like you insert a line about the Jews, and then you get like three or four people saying, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then you go to another beer hall, right? And then you get like five people saying, yeah, 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 when you throw in like, let's say, two lines about the Jews. And then you go to another beer hall, and then like the whole crowd will say, yeah, yeah, yeah. There are 10 people will egg you on when you talk about the Jews. So pretty soon there's this feedback mechanism between the politician and the crowd that, like, I'm just telling you what you want to hear.
Right.
It's not even, and so I mean, I don't want to justify the worst man of the 20th century in any way, but you could almost see how, like, well, he may not
Yeah,
have
but
even begun on a platform of like hating Jews, like in his own heart, even, right? Like he could have been a perfectly normal person, like without a hateful bone in his body, but quickly he realizes the path to power, the path to presidency, the path to unifying his country, out of an economic depression, is throw in a whole speech about Jews and be as shrill as you can about how they betrayed the country after World War One.
I think there is a lot of merit to that kind of almost mindless view of politics. And I think it's, mostly dominated by those types of feedback loops and sort of automatic processes in which human agency has a role, but it's not an overarching role. Like we are not in control of those processes. And it goes a long way towards explaining why most politicians' political programs are a hodgepodge of different things put together, because they are, pleasant to hear for the people who vote for them for the most part.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a
And
lot of merit to that, and you're tying that back to Salafism and Ayn
right.
Rand, because it's yeah, okay, so it's you are
Mhm.
sort of doing the same thing. Is that what you're
Right.
saying? That you
I
were
think so.
okay,
I think in the sense that, like, well, nation states are competing resources, and so therefore, you know, therefore, like America's, I mean, America's expansion of capitalism is a good thing, and then therefore, you know, Islam's expansion of a hardline form is also a good thing, because that's two civilizations just expanding in a way. And
mm,
so that's what they do, and so, like, in other words, you kind of have like better ideologies. And now I think about it, though, I didn't see the glaring contradiction, right? Because obviously, like, Salafism rejects modernity as a premise, right? Like, I mean,
right?
there's all these. I mean, I remember there's this guy named Daniel Hakiku. He does a whole debate about how Islam is the solution to modernity, and that's a traditional
And maybe it
rallying cry.
is.
I
It is
mean,
an adaptation to it, at least one of
like,
many.
so let me not go too far down this
Too far,
road,
yeah.
but
Okay.
I think, like, for example, like the prison system, many times, like, you'll come out a criminal even if you were not a criminal when you got in, just
Hmm.
because you had to hang around, hardened criminals. And also, like, often prisons are divided on racial or religious grounds. So even if you weren't racist when you when you were before in jail, you may have to suddenly find yourself,
Right.
tattooing a swastika or something on your forehead just to survive, right? Or not be raped or something. So but so I feel like maybe cutting off someone's hand for theft, and I'm talking about Grand Theft Auto, I'm not talking about stealing a bag of chips, but it would be more merciful than putting somebody in jail for like 5 years. I don't know, I'm not
Hmm.
sure, But actually, I was thinking about this with some Muslim friends on Discord, and so I think like maybe a digit or like it's called a phalange. I'm sure you'd know the word, but technically it's
Yeah.
the knuckle or whatever. So like you can just remove out of interpretive jurisprudence, you can just start removing knuckles. But I think prison time is kind of not good. But I mean, I wouldn't seriously argue for amputation. I understand that would be a laughable position and probably the end of
Well,
the conversation.
ultimately, it's about, well, the thing that prison has going for it, right, is that it kills two birds with the same stone, right? It's both a dreadful punishment, which you sort of want, which is the point of cutting off fingers or right, the tip of
The
a finger,
deterrence, yeah,
right? Yeah, and but it's also a way to put potentially dangerous people away from the general population, although that wouldn't necessarily apply to
deeds,
theft, right?
yeah. But yeah, no,
So,
for sure,
yeah,
for
that's the
violent murderers, people
I
who like
think
to
that is
stab
why
people and
yeah, I
like
think that is why prison eventually sort of emerged as a solution, right? Even though it
rehabilitation.
wasn't for a long time. For a long time, it was considered wasteful. For instance, in England, for the longest time, um, the punishment for theft, right, was just the rope,
Right. Yeah,
which is
colonial
not
America
exactly
too.
merciful, but you
Right.
can't argue that it's not efficient.
Yeah. And it costs a lot of money, by the way, to keep jails and policemen and watchmen. Like
Right,
you kind of needed an advanced economy to have a modern prison structure.
that's true.
And that's what I said. Like Islam came out in 7th century Arabia. It kind of like they didn't even know, they didn't even think about jails. So
Right, they
and
had quite different sensibilities, you could say.
right. And another thing is that they passed a law in California, which like stealing goods up to the value of $600 is not a felony. It's just like a misdemeanor. So like the cops will pick you up and like write you maybe a ticket and that's it. So it's like homeless people and drug addicts. They just walk into the store which have like $500 jeans. Like what is it? Not even Dolce and Gabbana, but there's like Fat Baby and
Right,
all that. But yeah. So just so yeah, people steal like an armful of expensive designer jeans and they walk out and security's not going to stop you because it's not their job. And so like if you have theft in a society, right, you can't have too much economic development because people are just
right.
carting stuff away. Like you can't really have civilization.
That's just it. Yeah, it's a well, part of it is just that the politicians want to virtue signal in the short term at the expense of the long term interest of the place they're running. And also, part of the problem is that they don't understand that, like, it's a general problem with the left, which is that they focus on how stuff is on how things are distributed and not how they are produced. So they would tend to, not punish someone for stealing, not taking into account what it does to the incentive system, right? And the
Right.
incentive system is just as important, especially for goods that need to be produced continuously. And well, that's just yeah, I think it's mostly a misunderstanding. It's like, yeah, there needs to be a way to distribute the goods, but you also need to maintain a system that allows for their production and distribution. And if you, yeah, if you just discourage people from just making stuff because it's just going to be taken away from them, well, you have nothing left to distribute in a way. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, that's the main reason why I had you on. Not even to disagree with you, just to mostly agree with you, even though it's ironic. Because normally I'd be touting something that's altruism, but I would agree with you 100%. If we have a social safety net, the goal should be to have a positive feedback loop to get someone back on their feet. And I think I swung a little bit more to the right during the COVID thing. It's because I work for the public sector, and it's like I realized that you need to have a healthy private sector to have a strong public sector. And so
Yeah,
if state and city governments can't collect taxes,
that's the
then you
thing.
can't have
People get
free
hung
spending.
up on socialism and capitalism, but in a way, capitalism makes socialism possible. And in a way, also, socialism makes capitalism possible. because the only way that capitalism can emerge is if there is a socialization of security, if there is a police force that ensures that there is not too much, you
Right.
know, theft and
Violence. Yeah.
murders and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Without which you can't have a high trust enough society that
Right.
you can have any form of capitalism, because capitalism requires payments and
Right.
contracts,
Security for them, right? And
right?
judges to enforce contracts. Yeah.
But it's also true that capitalism
We we
finances socialism
we
in
learn in
return,
political science. The state is that which has the monopoly on violence. So that's
right?
the number one thing you need to do to get society off its on its feet. It's like no one has the right to commit any violence except for the person with a badge and a gun. Who's accountable to the people ultimately. Hopefully. Yeah, no. So you're right. And sorry, what was your second point? You were saying what else about yeah, no, I mean, see, that's why I really like, that's why I knew I kind of had to talk to you, because even though like nominally, like when you first started, I was like, this person doesn't realize that, like, like but what you just said, like, so it's the capitalism needs socialism, and the reason it needs that is because there's companies go up and down, and so
Right.
you need to have unemployment benefits. You need to have, like you said, socialized police force in a way. You need to have an education system that's freely available so people can get skills. For example, Denmark's a great example in that, like, if you're unemployed, you get jobs training to go to a new field, and guess what? That helps people infinitely because they have an incredible GDP.
Right.
That every other, like, I mean, I just learned, like, because of COVID, they have to euthanize thousands of ferrets, but like I didn't even know that Denmark had this ferret export production
Right.
business, but they were raising first class coats with these mink, and
Holy
ferret like
shit! I
animals.
didn't know about it either.
Yeah, and like thousands and like, I mean, you just imagine thousands of animals being raised for production purposes. It's pretty impressive how you do that in such a small country, and like it's just a testament to the resources and ingenuity of their population. Like I know some Danes from online too, but yeah, like, I mean, there's you need to have a good combination of selfishness and also selflessness, and that's kind of the point that I was kind of raging at you when I first saw you, when you said like evolution does not allow us to have morality, because the way I figured it out is like, if I go to a party, friends or high school friends or people I barely know, acquaintances, it's like I will gladly do the dishes, because I love to talk to people, just do this street epistemology stuff, and just find where we can agree, even if nominally, I'm from the left and nominally you're from the right or whatever, and just like, if because labels aren't
Not really.
useful, not really,
Right.
right? So
Okay.
like labels aren't too useful, so it's like, but people react to you, once you kind of start talking a certain way, right? Because
Right.
so they
That's
they
true.
make tons of assumptions, and so but when you but what I'll do is I'll do the dishes. And I
Right.
remember, when I was at this high school, party with people I went to high school with, like a bunch of girls from high school, they were begging me not to do the dishes because, like, I don't really have to. And I said, look, you guys threw a lovely party and I wasn't listening, and they got the other one to talk to me and the other one. And, finally, I just did like more than half the dishes. But it's like, look, if I mutually enjoy something, then you enjoy. We can have more parties. I'll be invited again. We didn't get along great during high school, but it's like, and my other thing is, though, the reason I became so against Ayn Rand was because, like, we all need help at one point or another. So anybody who says that, like, anyone who needs help at any point is a mooch, which is not what you said, but like, this is why, like, I react, and I think other people may react as well, to too
Mhm.
much to the someone who's just for a sustainable welfare state. Um, or just a sustainable, like, budget, right? Like, states should have balanced budgets, right? It's not a bad idea to, like, just be to not put everything on a credit card, right? Because what happens when a person puts everything on the credit card, right? Sooner or
Right.
later,
I think the
the
reason I kind of argued against altruism is that I have a sort as became quite clear in my discussions with President Sunday and and Nathan have a more restrictive definition of it, right? Most of what you're describing to me sounds like more cooperation,
Yeah,
more what some biologists call reciprocal altruism, although I
right.
dispute, well, not exactly dispute, but I think that term is sort of misleading, because if you expect a benefit in return, it's by definition what makes it self-interested, right?
Yeah.
But also, what I'm saying about altruism is not that we
You know
shouldn't
what I
be
find funny though?
altruistic, is that
Right.
there isn't any there isn't much altruistic behavior in society currently, and most of what we call altruistic is actually cooperation in its many form. And so this wouldn't actually change anything about how we function, about how societies run, and how we behave. This would just change our view about ourselves, about whether or not we are quote unquote the good people, the nice people. No, I think it's quite important to realize that we are not that nice, is my point. Because we have a lot of problems that are created by virtue signaling spirals, for instance, in democracies, right?
Or not
And
caring also.
or not caring.
Just generally
What do you
speaking,
mean
right?
by
Like
that?
for example, like like our industrial agriculture produces so much manure, like from the pigs and the cows, that it
Right.
pollutes the
About waste, you
riverways.
mean? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Like
Yeah.
it's
Oh, yeah.
like
Indifference.
too much. Yeah, too much nitrogen in the water kills the life, and then where the river meets the sea, it kills all the sea life where the delta is or whatever.
Right.
Because you have so much fertilizer and nitrogen from the waste going
Right.
into the ecosystem.
Yeah. Indifference and lethargy are fair points too. They produce this very much the same kind of issues. And well, I think focusing as individuals and as collectives on sort of optimization of society would not make society less nice than it currently is. It would just make it more functional. And what people worry about when I argue about altruism, at least I get this feeling, is that they worry about society not being as nice. And I'm sure it would feel just as nice because it already isn't very altruistic, or it's accidentally altruistic.
Right. And also, like you said, like politicians giving out welfare isn't being done in an intelligent way that helps people get back on their feet, right? It's just done to win votes because,
Right. And
people
once
need.
people are used to it, the only way to gain more votes is to give more.
Yeah. And I mean, it's very funny because I was actually reading about the US Senate, which is actually the more powerful body, right? And so when you're in the House, because you're one of 435 members of Congress, you actually have a constituency. On average, it's about 300,000 people, but still, you're very attached to a place and geographic territory. But in the Senate, because there's only two from every state, you don't have constituencies so much you have interests. And because you have interests, it means that, like, for example, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, he always takes care of the coal industry, and the energy industry. So in other words, like you said, it looks altruistic, but what's really going on is and so for example, I know from working in public service, the food stamps program for the U.S. It's basically a corporate subsidy. Like Walmart writes in its quarterly reports that because food stamps benefits went down, we're down to make less profits, 2% this quarter or whatnot.
Hmm.
And so it's like all because the money goes on a card that can only be used to buy groceries, and yet there's no restriction on poor people buying ice cream for that. So you can buy all the ice cream and soda you want. Like we don't actually care if these people eat healthy or if they buy fruits and vegetables or potatoes. With this, or stretch out their money. It's like, yeah, like go ahead, eat chips and buy Coca-Cola for your kids. Like, no, we're not judging you in that respect. And that goes right back to Walmart, Costco, Coca-Cola, Lay's chips, Nabisco and Nestle.
I
So
didn't know about that, yeah. But
it's really a
yeah, I
subsidy
assumed that.
for agribusiness and the major food companies. When you really think about it, it's not
Hmm.
for the poor people per se.
That is very interesting. I think a lot of public investment in France is an indirect, like, present towards real estate investors, for instance.
Oh yeah. And even supposedly liberal politicians, like they're very
Yep.
beholden to real estate
Like
developers.
for instance, they will tell you that you can deduce, uh, the price of renovations from your tax, right? And that is something that is, that people like, because when they buy their first house, they can pay a little bit less money for making renovations or buying equipment. But it's also massively beneficial to someone who's got like 200 houses and who's running a real estate investment trust, for instance.
Yeah, they're passing a law extending that here in the U.S. But another thing that does is because you pay it in your tax, the contractor will sometimes show up to an old person's home, convince them they need more repairs than they actually need, like a new roof, and then because they only have one source of income, like pension,
Right.
they can't afford their own home, so it winds up making some people homeless because they didn't know what they were signing up for.
Right.
So, like you said, that
We had
then
something a bit like that too, which is that the rents went up massively in the last 20 years because there is like a special benefit that you get when your rent is a bit too high as compared to your revenue. So of course they raise the rents. That's It's just policy making without worrying about feedback, I guess is what
yeah,
I'm saying.
I remember in the 80s there used to be like whatever, if your income was less than your mortgage, you would just deduct whatever was the difference. And so people bought like more expensive houses knowing they could just write off their mortgage. And then
Mhm.
one day the law changed and then they were stuck with houses they should have never bought in the first place.
Right.
But like you said, the policy was short sighted.
I think this is as good a place as any to stop, because I'm getting pretty tired.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on and explaining your views. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, you too.
Have a
I'd be
great day.
glad to talk to you again someday.
Yeah, sure. Our President Sunday show, even.
Sure.
See you. Have a great night.
Have a good time.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.